In this paper, I'm looking at the relationship between protest and migration as a response to Kosovo's political and economic problems, and ask how these can be interpreted in terms of Hirschman's schema of voice and exit. Okay. So my PhD fieldwork was among Roma in Prizren in Kosovo from autumn 2013 to spring 2015. The Romani quarter, Terzi Mahala, is near the centre of town and it's relatively well integrated. Most of the men had factory work in socialist times but are now unemployed, with the exception of a few who work as cleaners or for NGOs. I volunteered at a local Roma NGO which worked on several projects, ranging from support of minority culture to advocacy and monitoring. They were funded by Western governments and agencies and aimed at promoting multiculturalism in a post-ethnic conflict area. As well as projects delivered in its official capacity in the absence of state services and employment, unofficially the NGO acted as a kind of social club and job centre. In the course of my fieldwork, I came to see the pervasive nature of economic problems in Kosovo, especially among Roma. There were very few formal jobs, and those that existed tended to be precarious and relied on access through personal networks. The reliance on personal networks, especially kin networks, for finding work, coupled with most of these networks being monoethnic, reproduced and increased the ethnic imbalance in employment, further disadvantaging Roma. Most people's incomes were based on informal work and remittances from relatives living abroad. As a result of these problems, many Roma migrated to the West while I was on my fieldwork. At the same time, there were large-scale protests in Kosovo, and the more I came to look at these migrations alongside protests that were happening at the same time, the more I started to think about them as part of the same process. In this paper, then, I discuss how approaching them as part of the same process can be a useful way of understanding the trajectories of the different groups involved in these events. So, in autumn of 2014, I noticed people starting to talk more and more about going to Hungary. One day a colleague was upset that he had sent his daughter to school with no food or money, and the next week he and his wife and children had gone, and there was no time for kind of emotional goodbyes. They just simply left in the night. And this was just something people were forwarding on Facebook, saying like, oh, please can they come back, because people were upset that so many people were leaving. So it became more and more common for my colleagues to start the day with a coffee and a discussion about which of their friends and relatives had gone. Most of those who left were young to middle-aged men, some of whom took their wives and children along too. As people live in extended families, this generally meant that some people remained in each household, especially women, children, and elderly people. Most families already had one male or one branch of the family living in the West and sending back remittances. So these discussions were often accompanied by a discussion about the economic problems in Kosovo and the reasons people had for leaving. So people would generally explain the migrations in terms of a search for bolji život, a better life. And the phrase was always used in Serbian, even if they were speaking in Romani, Albanian, or Turkish. Which is presumably because there was a Yugoslav TV series called Bolji Život, A Better Life, which shows a dysfunctional family that could inherit a lot of money if they fulfill certain criteria, making themselves better. So economic problems and emigration are not new in Kosovo. The group of Roma I was working with had been relatively privileged in Yugoslav times when compared with rural Albanians. The experience of post-socialism for these Roma is one familiar to people in many post-socialist countries, a loss of social entitlements and of job security. Rural Albanians, on the other hand, didn't have factory jobs or access to services in Yugoslav times. Economic deprivation and political marginalization, followed by severe repression of the Milosevic era, has meant that for many Albanians, the current problems are not really seen as economic decline. Rather, they're interpreted as a kind of political mismanagement. And there's a history of both peaceful and violent protest against political problems in Kosovo. In Yugoslav times, people from a range of backgrounds traveled to the West, primarily to Germany, as gastarbeiters and sent home remittances, which this is distinct from those who left as refugees during the conflict. They were seen as political migrants fleeing ethnic violence, while those leaving now, like the gastarbeiters, see themselves as economic migrants in search of this better life. So, in autumn 2014, as the Syrian refugees started to come through the Balkans, a new trafficking route opened up, making it a lot cheaper. So this was, as I said, autumn 2014, and the route was still not well known for the so-called migrant crisis. So people were taken from Kosovo to Belgrade or Subotica in Vojvodina, where they'd cross the Hungarian border in secret, and they'd wait in camps in Hungary until someone could take them to Germany, and then perhaps onwards to Sweden or Denmark. Yeah, sorry. Is that okay? Is that better? Okay. So many people had relatives waiting for them in the West, and they planned to seek asylum as political refugees. People told me that they didn't really think they were political refugees, that they were discriminated against, but they were sick of the situation in Kosovo and they wanted a better life. And there were also, at the time, rumours that Roma, Ashkali and Egyptians were being granted asylum in Germany, or that Germany had a quota for refugees and they would rather fill it with people from Eastern Europe than the Middle East. And the despair about the situation in Kosovo seemed to make people more willing to entertain these rumours, however implausible some of them were. At the same time, they were under no illusions about their chances of being granted asylum. So at best, they might have their chance of getting a better life, but failing that, they just had something to kind of do for the winter. The impetus to leave was stronger than that to stay, and they felt their best chance of finding a better life was abroad, though they didn't really like the idea of the West as well. Most people thought there was something unnatural and irreligious about the way people lived in the West. A far greater number of Albanians, on the other hand, chose to stay, and many chose to protest. So, not long after these migrations, large-scale protests erupted. The participants were primarily young Albanian men. The immediate catalyst for the protests were nationalist comments made by a Serb minister and the privatization of Trepče mines. But the complaints of the protesters clearly run much deeper. So they're a response to unfulfilled promises, corrupt government, and a lack of economic opportunities for those without the right connections, including for Albanians. The proximity of these migrations and the protests raises questions about the way the two groups responded. So why initially did Roma leave while Albanians protested? Were Albanians responding to a political problem while Roma were fleeing economic deprivation? And how do people understand their choices? And how do certain choices come into and out of different people's spheres of vision as a possible future? So, historical circumstances have affected the way the problem is understood and the way different groups understand poverty and discrimination. On the whole, political issues such as discrimination and economic ones, such as poverty, are understood as completely separate. The structural inequalities entailed in poverty of particular groups is not seen as pertinent. Similarly, the causes of migration were commonly viewed as being one or the other, political or economic. Despite the division between these categories being analytically very problematic, this distinction is pervasive. And in this case, people preferred to see themselves as more akin to guest workers than refugees. So the perception of migration, both in Kosovo and elsewhere, that divides economic and political causes is problematic for a variety of reasons. Firstly, it suggests that politics and economics are not intricately intertwined and that poverty and unemployment are beyond the control of political forces. Second, it leads to the understanding that political refugees have a right to asylum, while those who face cold, starvation and homelessness do not. This is particularly intractable for many Roma, as they're a group who are often structurally, severely economically disadvantaged. However, while I'd argue this distinction is not valid at a theoretical level, at an ethnographic level, at that of my participants, it's clearly used to explain migration. So when people talked about leaving for a better life, for bolji život, they were talking about economic migration and a life that would be economically more comfortable with a stable future. So now move on to discuss how the simultaneity of these migrations and protests can be viewed in terms of voice and exit. Hirschman's theory of voice and exit argues that when a problem starts to appear in a certain service or institution, people have two choices. So there's voice, some form of complaint, protest, or an attempt to change the system, or exit, so removing oneself from the problem. This theory has been applied to a variety of fields, including understanding markets and customers, and to migration. From this perspective, protesting the political and economic problems in Kosovo can be seen as using voice, while migrating to the West as a form of exit. Hirschman argues that the choice of exercising voice depends on the possibilities of exit. People will strive first to leave, and only when that's not possible, they'll protest. At first glance, this doesn't seem to explain why Roma left and Albanians did not originally. They both had similar possibilities regarding leaving. If anything, Roma feeling they can't protest, or that there's no hope in protest, meant they left, inverting this framework. So people told me that Roma were leaving because of poverty. Roma often discussed unemployment and the struggle to get by. While many Roma do live in extreme poverty in Kosovo, so do many non-Roma. And those I worked with were clearly not the poorest group. So my original feeling was that these Roma would not protest due to fear of reprisals, therefore they'd choose exit, whilst Albanians had a greater stake in the new republic, so felt it was worth raising their voice. But this is not the whole picture. While Roma were scared to protest, so were many Albanians. And they knew full well that the riot police responded with tear gas truncheons at these kind of protests, and there were many casualties. Similarly, while the Albanian majority were often seen as the constituent nation of Kosovo, and many Albanians feel a sense of ownership of the state, the Roma I worked with did have a strong sense of belonging in Prizren. So another point that's crucial to Hirschman's framework is people respond not just to low quality services, but to a decline in the quality of services. Roma were not just leaving because of living standards in Kosovo, but rather because of the decline in the living standards in Kosovo, which is to say the economic decline. So if economic deprivation is understood as economic decline, there must be a nostalgic memory of a time when things were better. Prizren Roma have a strong narrative of how things were better before the war, when there were jobs, when they had an income, and they had access to services through their workplaces. And they were unusually well integrated into the state system. For these Roma, a sense of economic decline with regards to the past and hopelessness with regards to the future meant they tried to solve economic problems through emigration. Poverty and lack of opportunity were not seen really as being part of the political system, and therefore didn't warrant a political response of protest. A nostalgia for the past is coupled with despair for the future. Many Albanians, on the other hand, in particular those who were independent farmers in the Yugoslav period, had suffered extreme deprivation. For them, the problems in Kosovo after the war may have been a great disappointment, as they expected more from independence, but it was unlikely they saw it as an economic decline. So to sum up, by looking at these migrations against a background of protest in Kosovo, it becomes clear how people perceive and make choices in response to difficult living conditions. The perception by Roma that the problems are primarily economic and in decline brings a sense of hopelessness. The economy is perceived as something separate from mainstream politics and beyond human control. The perception that economic problems are beyond their control, coupled with the risks associated with protests, meant that the choices of many Roma were oriented towards exit. Political problems, on the other hand, are seen as man-made and can be changed through protest. So there's, of course, a number of other factors involved in people's choices about how to respond to the situation. But by looking at migration in the context of protest, we can better understand the possibilities and choices open to different groups and the way they project their futures based on their experiences of the past.